Under the heavy veil of Siberian winter, 1951, a train departed from a remote siding near the settlement of Komsomolsk na Amur. Its cargo was not lumber, nor coal, nor food for the starving towns beyond the taiga. It carried prisoners, convicts, political exiles, and vanished men whose names never made it past the paper they were scrawled on. The convoy consisted of 22 sealed wagons, each marked only with faded red numbers and guarded by men in NKVD uniforms wrapped in furs. The locomotive itself was coal-fired, belching thick smoke into the pale sky, watched by workers who, according to one later testimony, pretended not to see it pass. Official records list this as routine transport February 12, 1951, destination Norilsk Correctional Labor Camp, number 6. But in the archives we found later fragments, smudged reports, unsigned notes. This train is mentioned in whispers, Convoy Isheznuvshi, the convoy that disappeared. No arrival was recorded in Norilsk. The NKVD guards supposedly escorting the prisoners never returned. Weeks later, frantic telegrams were exchanged between Moscow and Krasnoyarsk. Convoy 7 not confirmed. Investigate delay. By spring, the trail was cold. A Soviet commission was convened, then immediately dissolved. The files were classified Osobo Vajno, top secret, too dangerous for even the Politburo to probe openly. And yet, like the train itself, the truth never surfaced. In the testimonies of local railway workers, gathered secretly years later, there are strange consistencies. A signalman at an outpost near Tura wrote in his diary, later confiscated, that the train passed at night but it made no sound. The wagons seemed heavier than steel, the lamps all extinguished. Another worker described an unnatural stillness along the track, as if the taiga itself held its breath. They claimed the rails were frozen harder than usual the next morning, and a fine black dust coated the ballast stones. Samples taken by engineers reportedly corroded their instruments. What was aboard Convoy 7? Officially, Gulag transfers were common tens of thousands, moved yearly across the endless rail lines of Siberia. But in these same years, hidden projects thrived in the frozen north. The Soviets experimented with underground nuclear detonations, geomagnetic research, and clandestine biological studies housed in secret cities, closed to all outsiders. Could this convoy have been redirected not to Norilsk, but to one of these forbidden sites? A file fragment from the archives in Novosibirsk mentions, cargo unsuitable for civilian exposure escort required, prisoner cover story maintained. The phrase prisoner cover story repeats like a code through several surviving documents. Whispers of the disappearance reached the prisoners' families. Mothers who came to inquire about their sons were told only, "No such person is registered in Norilsk." Some received forged death certificates dated weeks before the convoy departed. Others received nothing at all. Years later, an old woman in Omsk claimed that every time she went to ask about her husband, the clerk would whisper, "Don't keep asking, or you'll join him." Stranger still are the accounts from hunters in the taiga. In 1952, near the banks of the lower Tunguska River, reindeer herders stumbled upon twisted rails in the snow. They spoke of a black carriage half buried in the frozen ground, its doors welded shut from the inside. When they reported the find to the authorities, the site was sealed off. The herders were warned never to return. One of them later told his grandson, "The forest there hums at night as if the train still breathes underground." This is how the mystery begins: a train that departed, a convoy that never arrived, archives half burned, testimonies confiscated. What remains is only a trail of silence, and silence in the Soviet Union often meant something far more sinister than the absence of truth. The first inquiries into the missing train were perfunctory, as if the authorities themselves feared to ask too much. In late February 1951, an internal NKVD memorandum circulated between Krasnoyarsk and Moscow, stamped with the crimson seal of Soversheno Sekretno, most secret. It read, "Convoy 7 failed to report. Telegraph silence confirmed after 36 hours. Railway checkpoints between Tura and Igarka did not log passage. Investigate discreetly. Avoid public acknowledgement. There was no follow-up visible in the surviving archives, only the word Snyato removed, scrawled in the margin weeks later. Unofficially, rumors spread quickly among the lower ranks. Station masters whispered about a locomotive crew that had vanished along with the prisoners. In villages scattered along the Yenisei River, peasants recalled NKVD trucks arriving suddenly in March, setting up roadblocks on frozen tracks, and then disappearing after a day without explanation. Witnesses described soldiers combing the forest with dogs, though no trail was ever revealed. What little was known was silenced through intimidation. One worker at a siding near Dudinka spoke too freely about seeing strange lights in the forest the night the train went missing. Within a week, he was reassigned to a uranium mine in Kolyma, never to be heard from again. The missing convoy began to generate contradictions within official reports. Some documents claimed the train derailed in a snowstorm, and all evidence was buried. Others stated flatly that Convoy 7 never existed, clerical error. Yet requisition orders for food, coal, and escort personnel matched precisely to the train's departure date. Even more curious, requisition papers for additional wagons, 4 more than the official 22, were filed in January. These wagons appear in no subsequent inventory. A heavily redacted KGB report from 1963, uncovered after the Soviet collapse, mentions the incident obliquely. 1951 convoy classified under Directive Meteor. Evidence erased from transport logs. Surviving witnesses unreliable. Terminate inquiries. The code word Meteor recurs in unrelated files dealing with high-altitude nuclear tests and geological anomalies in Siberia. It suggests that the convoy's disappearance may have been tied not simply to prisoner transfer, but to an experimental program buried under multiple layers of secrecy. In parallel, oral testimonies hint at something stranger. In 1955, a former railway guard, drunk in a Novosibirsk tavern, muttered that the wagons were not for men, but for things brought from the ground. He claimed the prisoners were a cover, bodies for the paperwork, while the sealed wagons contained metallic crates guarded more tightly than the human cargo. When pressed, he became frightened and retracted the story, insisting it was just a joke. Months later, he died in what the local paper described as a logging accident. Folklore in the region adapted quickly to the void of truth. Along the taiga, hunters began speaking of the Cherny Poezd, the black train that still roamed the forest tracks at night, without smoke or steam. Reindeer herders warned their children not to follow strange rail sounds in the snow, claiming, "The train calls people inside." These stories were dismissed by officials as superstition, but they reveal how deeply the absence of answers unsettled those who lived nearest the vanishing point. The disappearance also cast a shadow over the families of the prisoners. Hundreds of relatives petitioned local authorities for news, sending letters to camp commandants and regional party committees. Some received replies stating that their relatives had died en route from illness. Others received no answer at all. One letter, preserved by a family in Tomsk, was stamped with a peculiar seal, "Returned undeliverable, addressee unknown." But the addressee was the Norilsk camp, which certainly existed. The silence surrounding Convoy 7 created a pattern typical of Soviet secrecy. Fragmentary documents, erased names, contradictory testimonies, and a trail of intimidation. The more the authorities insisted that nothing unusual had occurred, the clearer it became that something extraordinary had been buried. The official explanation was absence. The unofficial reality was fear. By summer 1951, the case had disappeared from all known NKVD records. It was as if the train had never been logged, never departed, never carried its human cargo into the Siberian night. Yet the fragments that survive point to a darker possibility that Convoy 7 was not lost by accident, but deliberately consumed by a project whose traces were not meant to reach the surface. By the autumn of 1951, the disappearance of Convoy 7 was no longer spoken of in official circles, but its shadow lingered in the Siberian frontier. Surviving internal notes from the Ministry of Internal Affairs suggest that the event was quietly reclassified under the jurisdiction of special projects. An unsigned directive dated September reads, "All matters pertaining to Convoy 7 are to be handled under Department V. Maintain operational silence. Noncompliance constitutes sabotage." Department V was a euphemism often used for counterintelligence operations, but in other contexts, it appears linked to research facilities buried deep in the Ural and Siberian wilderness. Across the railway network, inconsistencies multiplied. Freight manifests in Krasnoyarsk station books show gaps in numbering for early 1951. Passenger locomotives scheduled to pass through the same corridors reported unexplained delays, with signal stations reporting track occupied long after no train was visible. A declassified 1974 KGB technical study noted these anomalies and suggested radio interference or false echoes on the line. Yet engineers interviewed decades later described unexplained magnetization of the rails near Tura, as if powerful electromagnetic equipment had once passed through. Local testimonies began surfacing in whispers, carried by those who had no connection to the Gulag system, yet lived near the affected areas. Hunters along the Yenisei River spoke of finding charred fragments of railway ties in places where no fire had been reported. In one such site, later sealed by soldiers, a hunter found the remains of a wagon coupling fused as though melted by extreme heat. He smuggled it back to his village, only to be arrested days later. His family insisted that NKVD men search their home, confiscated the fragment, and warned them that discussing it would bring exile. The man was sentenced to 15 years for theft of socialist property and never returned. The Soviet state attempted to fill the silence with disinformation. A Pravda article from January 1952 briefly mentioned a railway accident in the north, but attributed it to natural causes, blizzard conditions. No location, no figures, no names. To those aware of Convoy 7, it was a signal. The state would not explain, but it would invent a cover story. Regional party bulletins instructed local cadres to discourage speculation among railway workers. NKVD officers were placed at taverns in towns near the route, listening for drunken tongues. Arrest records from Igarka and Dudinka reveal a surge of charges for anti-Soviet agitation in that year, suggesting that many locals had begun discussing the train that vanished. At the same time, scattered clues suggested the prisoners themselves may not have been ordinary convicts. Lists obtained from camp archives decades later show names inconsistent with common Gulag demographics. Many were not peasants, deserters, or criminals, but engineers, geologists, and technicians previously attached to state enterprises in Kazakhstan and the Urals. Their sudden sentences coincided with classified projects involving uranium mining and metallurgical plants. In one partially preserved NKVD file, the convoy is described as carrying Category B personnel. This vague classification appears in other contexts related to restricted scientific labor. The implication is unsettling. Convoy 7 may have been less about transporting prisoners to a labor camp and more about transferring unwilling specialists to a site of experimentation. Rumors of such a site emerged from testimonies collected in the late Soviet era. Residents of Evenk villages spoke of a forbidden valley beyond the Kureka River, where aircraft circled regularly and strangers in white coats were occasionally seen arriving under guard. Hunters who wandered too close reported nausea, bleeding gums, and sudden sickness in their reindeer herds. They described hearing metallic thunder under the ground, even on days when the skies were clear. These tales, while indistinct, coincide with maps showing abandoned spur lines branching from the main Siberian railway into the taiga lines that appear on no official transport plans. The human dimension of the disappearance deepened with time. Relatives of the missing continued to write letters through the 1950s. Most returned unopened. In Moscow, a small group of wives formed an informal circle, hoping for news of their husbands. NKVD surveillance records later declassified show that these women were followed, their phones tapped, their correspondence intercepted. One chilling note reads, "Subject continues inquiries into Convoy 7, arrange cessation." Several of the women were arrested in 1953, accused of contacts with foreign agents. Their fate is absent from any surviving record. By 1954, with Stalin dead and the political winds shifting, mention of Convoy 7 all but disappeared from internal correspondence. Yet among veterans of the security services, it lingered as a cautionary tale. Retired colonels interviewed in the 1980s hinted that the convoy had been requisitioned by an entirely separate branch of the state, one that left no trail even in the secret archives. One man, speaking anonymously, described it as an experiment so catastrophic that it was erased, not forgotten. Thus, by the mid-1950s, the story of the disappearing train had transformed from a logistical mystery into a whispered legend. It was no longer simply a question of where the train had gone, but why it had left in the first place, and what secrets the Soviet state had buried beneath layers of falsified reports, sudden arrests, and inexplicable silence. Through the late 1950s, the few surviving traces of Convoy 7 were buried beneath new layers of secrecy, yet rumors persisted in the Siberian wilderness. The official line remained silence. The train had never existed. The prisoners had never been sentenced. The guards never recruited. Still, inconsistencies surfaced. In 1957, when Soviet authorities compiled records for an internal review of Gulag transfers during Khrushchev's partial thaw, clerks in Novosibirsk noted that prisoner numbers in Norilsk camps had inexplicably decreased compared to the number of arrests registered in early 1951. These discrepancies were dismissed as archival miscounts, but annotations in the margins of the report suggested otherwise. Convoy discrepancy unresolved. Cross-reference restricted file Meteor. At the same time, field testimonies grew darker. Engineers sent to repair a remote stretch of track along the Yenisei Basin found rails twisted as though bent by pressure from beneath the earth. The soil around the site was unusually hard, fused into a glassy texture. Geologists took samples but never published their results. The crates disappeared en route to Moscow. A local worker later claimed that one of the engineers vomited blood after handling the soil, and within weeks, the entire crew had been reassigned and replaced by military specialists. Folklore expanded around the vanishing point. Evenk hunters described strange humming noises at night, like iron grinding below ground. Their stories told of shadows crossing the forest without leaving footprints, and of deer bolting suddenly as though sensing something unseen. In one account, a group of children from a nearby village wandered near the sealed tracks and returned sick, with bleeding gums and fevers that lasted for weeks. The elders whispered that they had walked into the Valley of the Black Train. Inside the Soviet security services, the matter remained classified but not forgotten. A fragment from a KGB memorandum in 1961 refers obliquely to legacy incidents complicating civilian relocation near Kureka. The phrase suggests that the region of the disappearance remained off-limits to settlement, even as Siberia was otherwise open to industry. Satellite images taken decades later, after the collapse of the USSR, showed large swathes of abandoned forest with no villages, no roads, and no record of economic activity. It was a hole on the map precisely where Convoy 7 was last reported. For the families of the missing, the late 1950s brought only fresh wounds. Some were issued official papers stating their relatives had died of pneumonia or work accidents in camps that they were never registered in. Others received nothing, their petitions ignored. A widow from Omsk later testified to a human rights committee in the 1990s that her husband's photograph was confiscated during a police search in 1958, with the officer saying only, "This man no longer exists." By the dawn of the 1960s, the disappearing Gulag train had become less a mystery of logistics and more a taboo subject, one that no Soviet citizen dared to mention in public. Yet in the scattered whispers of villagers, in the corrupted soil samples, and in the vanished records buried under code names, the shadow of Convoy 7 continued to expand. It was no longer simply a train lost in the taiga. It was a wound on the Soviet landscape, and the deeper one dug, the more poisonous the silence became. By the early 1960s, when Khrushchev's thaw promised limited revelations about the Gulag, those who sought answers about Convoy 7 encountered only deeper walls of silence. The campaign to expose Stalin's crimes produced volumes of released names, but among them, none of the prisoners scheduled for transport in February 1951 appeared. In official publications, it was as if hundreds of men and women had never been arrested. For relatives desperate to see confirmation, the omission was a quiet death sentence proof not only of their loss, but of its deliberate erasure. At the same time, the Soviet state attempted to conceal traces of the convoy through bureaucratic manipulation. Entire ledgers of Gulag camp transfers were rewritten in the early 1960s, with typewritten pages replacing handwritten ones. A forensic review conducted in the 1990s revealed telltale inconsistencies, erased carbon copies, mismatched ink, falsified dates. In several cases, prisoners listed as transferred to Norilsk in 1951 appeared simultaneously in unrelated arrest logs months later, sometimes marked released, other times deceased. The contradictions were not errors, but intentional fabrications, layered to confuse anyone attempting to follow the trail. Meanwhile, classified research activity expanded in the northern wilderness. The Soviet Union's strategic obsession with nuclear parity, geophysical manipulation, and secret weapons drove the establishment of dozens of closed zones. Declassified documents reveal that between 1951 and 1954, at least 2 restricted areas were created near the Koreka River under the guise of hydrological monitoring stations. These were controlled not by civilian ministries, but by the Ministry of Medium Machine Building, the body responsible for the nuclear program. Their proximity to the last known path of Convoy 7 is striking. Eyewitness fragments from locals suggest sinister connections. In 1962, a hunter in the taiga reported stumbling upon scorched earth where no fires had burned. He described metallic wreckage, half sunken in permafrost, with symbols he could not read. He claimed the air shimmered unnaturally, and that his skin blistered by the time he returned to his village. He died within months. Soviet doctors attributed it to tuberculosis, though his symptoms hair loss, lesions, hemorrhaging a line, disturbingly with radiation sickness. The convoy itself became entwined with these accounts. Rumors spread that the sealed wagons had carried not prisoners but experimental materials, uranium ore, unstable prototypes, or perhaps biological specimens. The supposed prisoners may have been cover or unwilling specialists tasked with handling the cargo. The NKVD's practice of disguising research transfers as penal transports had precedent. At least 3 other known cases exist where engineers were moved under the label of convicts. Convoy 7 may have been one of the most extreme examples of this method. Suppression of information remained ruthless. In 1965, an amateur historian from Krasnoyarsk tried to publish an article about disappearing convoys in a local journal. The issue was halted, and he was interrogated by the KGB. Surviving interrogation notes accuse him of foreign agitation and suggest he was sentenced to 5 years in a psychiatric ward. His family recalled that he had been particularly interested in the train that did not arrive in Norilsk. Locals kept the story alive in folklore, adapting it to the language of myth. Along the rivers and forests, tales of a spectral train circulated. a black locomotive without smoke, appearing in snowstorms and vanishing on tracks long torn up. Villagers said those who saw it too closely sickened or went mad. Children were warned not to follow its whistle, which some claimed could be heard even when the railbeds lay buried under decades of forest regrowth. By the end of the 1960s, the official memory of Convoy 7 had been effectively erased, but its shadow stretched into science, rumor, and fear. The vanished prisoners, the twisted rails, the forbidden zones all pointed to something larger than an accident. Whether it was a catastrophe, an experiment gone wrong, or an intentional disappearance, the train had become part of a darker fabric of Soviet secrecy, woven tightly enough that even the thaw of de-Stalinization could not unravel it. By the 1970s, the traces of Convoy 7 seemed to belong to another age, swallowed by 2 decades of silence. Yet beneath the surface of Soviet society, the mystery persisted like a fault line one that occasionally cracked open to reveal unsettling glimpses of what may have happened in 1951. In the era of Brezhnev's stagnation, when stability was prized above all else, the story of the disappearing Gulag train became less a forgotten accident and more a forbidden riddle. Unofficial researchers, often dissident intellectuals or retired railway workers, tried to piece together fragments of the past. In samizdat circles, typed sheets circulated under the title The Black Convoy. These underground essays compiled testimonies from families, scattered references in local newspapers, and whispered accounts from hunters. One particularly detailed report, attributed to a former geologist from Tomsk, claimed that the train had been rerouted onto a spur line leading not to Norilsk, but to a clandestine facility hidden near Lake Lama. The document included sketches of strange concrete structures, partly sunken into tundra, with heavy cables stretching into the ground. Though unverifiable, it matched descriptions later confirmed by declassified aerial reconnaissance. Unexplained installations in regions officially recorded as uninhabited. Soviet archives from the period hint that state security remained anxious about the matter. A 1972 KGB directive marked Poisk 3 ordered surveillance of railway veterans known to spread harmful rumors about non-existent convoys. Another note from 1974 references renewed civilian curiosity about past incidents along Kureka Line disciplinary action authorized. This bureaucratic language masks the persistence of fear. The state still monitored the story decades later, suggesting that it remained linked to secrets too dangerous to surface. Technical anomalies also resurfaced. In 1975, engineers repairing electrical lines near Dudinka reported inexplicable interference with their instruments. Compasses spun erratically, radio signals collapsed, and several workers complained of severe headaches. Soil samples taken from the area emitted low but measurable radiation. The engineers' reports were classified, and the region was closed to further civilian access. Local villagers, however, remembered the episode. Livestock deaths, water that tasted of metal, and helicopters ferrying men in protective suits who camped for weeks before vanishing without explanation. In oral testimonies recorded years later, retired railway personnel revealed details they had been too afraid to share earlier. One former signal operator described receiving urgent orders on the night of February 12, 1951, to divert a train onto a rarely used branch line. He obeyed, but was puzzled. Such diversions were never made without higher authorization. Hours later, he claimed, the telegraph lines in the area went dead, and he was instructed never to speak of the incident. His story, preserved in the late 1980s by local historians, adds weight to the possibility that Convoy 7 was deliberately redirected into secrecy, not lost by chance. Prisoner lists examined by dissidents also revealed anomalies. While most records of 1951 Gulag inmates followed familiar patterns of arrests and transfers, one set of documents contained names that later appeared in Soviet technical journals under different identities. Engineers supposedly sentenced for economic crimes were publishing papers on metallurgy or geology by the late 1950s, yet their prison terms were never officially commuted. It is as if their identities had been rewritten. Were these the same men allegedly aboard Convoy 7, or were their names appropriated to conceal other fates? Folklore around the vanished train continued to evolve. In Evenk villages, elders spoke of a metal serpent that entered the forest and never returned. They claimed the earth itself had swallowed it, leaving only poisoned rivers and silent animals in its wake. Children grew up fearing the abandoned railbeds, where moss covered the ties, but strange humming could still be heard at dusk. These myths, while dismissed as superstition, reflect a consistent memory of disruption, of a landscape scarred by something that resisted ordinary explanation. The Brezhnev-era press never mentioned Convoy 7, yet gaps in official histories are often more telling than admissions. In multiple Soviet encyclopedias published during the 1970s, the section on Norilsk labor camps lists transport figures for every year except 1951. The omission is small, easily overlooked, but persistent across editions. Scholars later concluded this was a deliberate deletion, a subtle trace of censorship that paradoxically preserved the outline of what had been hidden. Meanwhile, in foreign intelligence circles, whispers of the incident surfaced. Western analysts, examining fragmentary satellite images of Siberian rail networks, speculated about lost trains and concealed facilities. A CIA briefing from 1978, later declassified, mentions rumors of experimental transports disguised as penal convoys. Though lacking proof, the fact that Western agencies noted the story demonstrates how far it had traveled, carried not only by dissident whispers, but by the silent anomalies of the Soviet landscape itself. By the late 1970s, the memory of Convoy 7 straddled two worlds. In the Soviet Union, it survived as rumor, myth, and suppressed archive fragments. Outside, it circulated as speculation among analysts and exiles. The vanished train had become more than an incident. It was a prism reflecting the contradictions of Soviet secrecy. Whether it carried prisoners, scientists, or something stranger, its disappearance remained a reminder of how entire events could be erased, leaving only distortions behind. The 1970s ended without answers. The state preserved its silence, the land bore its scars, and the families of the missing grew old with unanswered questions. Yet each new fragment, each testimony, each omission, each anomaly added to the weight of the unsolved. Convoy 7 was no longer just a mystery of 1951. It had become a ghost, stretching across decades, defying every attempt to consign it to the past. By the early 1980s, the legend of Convoy 7 had reached a strange equilibrium, half buried beneath layers of censorship, half sustained by the whispers of those who remembered. The Soviet Union, now under Brezhnev's final years and then the uncertain transition toward Andropov and Chernenko, clung to the facade of stability. Yet within the cracks of that facade, traces of the lost train resurfaced in unsettling ways. In 1981, a secret memorandum circulated within the Ministry of Internal Affairs referenced legacy anomalies in transport files, requiring continued suppression. Though vague, the file was attached to an index containing only one recognizable word: meteor. Once again, the same codename that had haunted earlier documents. The fact that the issue still warranted classification 3 decades later suggests that the matter had never truly been resolved. Meanwhile, stories from Siberia began to take on new urgency. Miners working near Talnakh reported sudden cave-ins in tunnels that revealed rusted metal beams unlike any used in standard Soviet construction. Some swore they saw fragments of rail wheels embedded deep in the permafrost, too corroded to date, but out of place by hundreds of kilometers. When the site was reported, military trucks appeared, sealed the shaft, and declared it unsafe. The miners were transferred elsewhere. Local rumor insisted the shaft had exposed a buried section of the missing convoy. In 1983, a schoolteacher from Norilsk was arrested after circulating handwritten pamphlets to her students titled the train that never arrived. She drew on family testimony. Her uncle had been among those assigned as guards and described him as swallowed by the forest along with the prisoners. The authorities charged her with spreading anti-Soviet agitation. Her trial was closed, and the verdict was exile to Kazakhstan. Her writings, however, circulated in Samizdat and fueled the underground mythology of Convoy 7. Environmental anomalies also persisted. Hunters recorded zones of forest where trees grew stunted and twisted, the soil barren, animals avoiding the area entirely. Scientists sent in under the guise of ecological surveys, collected samples but never published results. Decades later, when one of those scientists defected to the West, he revealed that the soil near the Kureka Valley showed signs of radiation inconsistent with natural sources, as though an unrecorded contamination event had occurred in 1951. KGB veterans nearing retirement began to speak in hushed tones about the event. One colonel, interviewed secretly by dissident historians, described Convoy 7 as a special transfer, not of criminals but of undesirables of a different sort. When pressed, he refused to elaborate, merely saying, "It was not prisoners. It was something the state wanted to move quietly, without anyone knowing, and it went wrong." His testimony hinted at an experiment or cargo that had vanished, leaving only silence in its wake. Folklore in evenk communities by this time had evolved into ritual caution. Hunters avoided certain valleys entirely, performing small offerings before entering nearby forests. They spoke of hearing metallic groans beneath the ground and described winter nights when the wind carried the echo of a whistle, though the nearest working trains were hundreds of kilometers away. One elder explained it simply: "The train is still traveling. It has not found its station." Western intelligence, increasingly able to track Soviet activities with satellites, noted unusual restrictions in the very region where Convoy 7 had vanished. Reconnaissance photos revealed closed zones with small installations, antennas, and guarded perimeters. Analysts speculated about radar testing, early warning systems, or nuclear storage. But a few intelligence notes filed under low-confidence sources included the phrase, "train disappearance in 1951 still unexplained." That a Cold War intelligence community even entertained such a phrase shows the lingering strangeness of the case. By the middle of the decade, the Soviet Union itself was entering decline. The disappearance of Convoy 7, long suppressed, seemed emblematic of the broader rot. An entire event erased, questions forbidden, scars left on the land and in memory. Those who tried to investigate faced exile, imprisonment, or silence, yet the story endured because erasure never destroys, it leaves behind shadows, distortions, and echoes that refuse to vanish. Thus, by 1985, Convoy 7 remained a ghost locked in Soviet files and whispered in villages of the north. 34 years had passed since the train left Brest, yet its absence was still felt. And as the Soviet Union began to creak under the weight of its own secrets, the memory of the lost convoy pressed against the cracks in the system, waiting for the moment when silence might finally break. When the Soviet Union entered the Gorbachev era, the policy of glasnost promised openness, yet certain subjects remained so deeply buried that they resisted exposure. Among them was the question of Convoy 7. In the late 1980s, as archives cautiously opened, dissidents and journalists sought evidence of the train that vanished in 1951. What they found instead was a trail of contradictions and absences files marked as destroyed, entries missing from indexes, references replaced with blank pages. The silence around the convoy seemed deliberate, more thorough than around many of Stalin's better-known crimes. Local archives in Krasnoyarsk and Norilsk yielded tantalizing hints. A ledger of camp arrivals in February 1951 contained a blank row with prisoner numbers jumping inexplicably by several hundred. A typewritten annotation simply read, "Corrected." In another volume, the name of a supposed transfer officer was blacked out with thick ink, though subsequent entries listed him as deceased the following year in an aviation accident. Researchers came to suspect that those who had overseen the convoy were themselves eliminated, their names buried alongside the event they had witnessed. At the same time, oral testimony began to emerge with greater boldness. Elderly railway workers recalled strange nights of unexplained diversions, of stations ordered to log nothing, of telegraph lines cut in synchrony with the convoy's passage. In 1987, one retired dispatcher told a Moscow newspaper before his interview was abruptly suppressed that a whole train passed through my signal post and I was ordered to write nothing. It was as if the state asked me to pretend my own eyes had lied. His words never appeared in print, but a carbon copy of the transcript circulated underground, fueling renewed curiosity. Environmental surveys, released cautiously during Glasnost, revealed anomalies near the Kureka Valley. Soil samples showed traces of cesium-137 and strontium-90 in levels inconsistent with fallout from known nuclear tests. Forestry reports noted dead zones where trees had failed to regrow for decades, suggesting contamination events far earlier than officially acknowledged. Some ecologists speculated privately that a transport of radioactive material may have been involved, disguised as a Gulag transfer. Yet no official admission was made, and the data was quickly reclassified after publication. Folklore also took on new life in this climate of cautious openness. In villages near the Yenisei, stories once whispered became told aloud, though still with caution. Old hunters recalled seeing lights in the sky above sealed valleys, strange humming that made dogs howl, and soldiers who came not to fight, but to erase traces. Younger generations repeated tales of a black train that appeared in snowstorms, carrying the condemned into the earth. In the context of Glasnost, these stories were no longer dismissed merely as superstition, but as veiled memory of something that had happened and could not be spoken. International interest grew as well. Western journalists, visiting Siberia in the late 1980s, encountered locals willing to hint at the train that vanished. Some reports reached newspapers in Europe, couched as human interest stories of Soviet secrecy. Intelligence analysts, already aware of the persistent code name Meteor in declassified files, began to connect the dots. A vanished convoy, closed military zones, environmental anomalies, and a legacy of intimidation. Speculation spread that Convoy 7 was tied to early Soviet nuclear experiments, perhaps the transport of unstable material, or even a failed test disguised as a prisoner transfer. For the families of the missing, Glasnost brought neither clarity nor closure. Letters once ignored were now acknowledged, but with evasive replies. No information available. A small group of widows traveled to Moscow in 1988 to petition Gorbachev's government directly. Their appeal was politely filed, then quietly shelved. One widow, interviewed in private by a foreign journalist, said bitterly, "For 37 years they have told me nothing. Even now, in this time of truth, they act as if my husband never lived." Within the KGB itself, reform-minded officers reportedly debated whether to reveal long-classified legacy anomalies. Some pushed for disclosure, arguing that silence only fueled speculation. Others insisted the truth was too dangerous, that Convoy 7 had carried not only prisoners, but something catastrophic to Soviet security, if revealed. In the end, Glasnost loosened many archives, but on Convoy 7 the silence remained absolute. Files stayed sealed, testimonies suppressed, anomalies unexplained. By the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, the story of Convoy 7 had crossed from forbidden rumor into uneasy legend. The state that had hidden it no longer existed, yet the new Russian Federation inherited only fragments and silences. Researchers were free to search, but the records had already been erased or buried decades earlier. For some, this absence confirmed the worst suspicions, that the convoy had been consumed by a project so secret, so dangerous, that even Glasnost could not unearth it. And thus, on the edge of a collapsing empire, the mystery endured. The Soviet Union had vanished, but so too had the train, and in the ruins of archives and the whispers of witnesses, the silence grew heavier, as if guarding something that still had not finished unfolding. When the Soviet Union disintegrated in 1991, there was hope that the collapse of censorship might finally reveal the fate of Convoy 7. Instead, researchers found absence more chilling than denial. Regional archives in Krasnoyarsk, Norilsk, and Moscow contained gaping holes for early 1951. Transport records that survived stopped abruptly in January, resuming in March as if February had been erased entirely. Prisoner files listed hundreds of arrests with no subsequent entries. Even digital catalogs created in the 1990s omitted the relevant reference numbers, as though someone had physically removed the pages before scanning. Attempts to investigate often met with obstruction. Local officials insisted records had been lost in fires, a familiar Soviet-era excuse. Military archivists claimed such transports were outside their competence. Independent journalists visiting Siberia were sometimes followed, their notes confiscated, and interviews interrupted. One Moscow historian who traveled to Dudinka in 1993 to speak with elderly railway workers returned shaken, saying only, "They told me the forest does not forget, but men should." Within weeks, he abandoned his research. Yet fragments continued to surface. A former KGB officer, speaking anonymously to a Russian newspaper in 1994, admitted that Convoy 7 had been redirected under orders not signed on paper. He described it as part of a project codenamed Meteor, consistent with earlier glimpses in declassified documents. He refused to say what was inside the train, only that it was not meant to reach Norilsk, and it did not. The article was pulled after a single print run, and the journalist who wrote it left the country soon after, claiming harassment. Villagers in Evenkia and along the Yenisei continued to share stories passed down since the 1950s. They spoke of poisoned rivers where fish died without cause, of valleys where hunters disappeared, and of a black train whose whistle could be heard on frozen nights long after the rails had rusted away. These oral histories, dismissed officially as folklore, nonetheless matched details in suppressed reports: zones of scorched soil, illness among reindeer herds, strange aerial patrols above uninhabited tundra. For the families of the missing, post-Soviet openness provided little comfort. Inquiries to the Memorial Society, which worked to document Stalinist repressions, yielded acknowledgement that transport records for February 1951 contain anomalies. But no names were restored, no deaths confirmed. Widows now elderly were told their husbands remain unaccounted for. Children of the disappeared grew old still seeking answers. Speculation filled the void. Some believed Convoy 7 carried prisoners pressed into nuclear experiments, vanishing in a radiation accident covered up as a transport mishap. Others claimed the sealed wagons held experimental equipment too unstable to survive, buried deliberately in the wilderness. A few suggested something stranger, that the convoy was diverted into a site connected with unexplained geological phenomena, and that what consumed it was not human secrecy, but something inhuman in the taiga itself. The 1990s brought chaos and freedom, but not truth. Just as Soviet silence had obscured the train's fate, post-Soviet disorder ensured that no coherent investigation was ever completed. The convoy remained a phantom, its traces scattered in censored files, poisoned landscapes, and whispered stories. Even in an era of supposed openness, its absence spoke louder than words, a reminder that some secrets had been buried too deep, and that whatever happened in the winter of 1951 was still considered dangerous to know. Today, the story of the disappearing Gulag Convoy stands as one of the Cold War's unresolved enigmas. Official Soviet records never acknowledged the loss, and the Russian Federation has made no attempt to clarify what happened. Instead, researchers are left with fragments: erased transport ledgers, environmental anomalies, suppressed testimonies, and scattered rumors that refuse to die. Unlike many tragedies of the Gulag, where names and graves were eventually recovered, Convoy 7 remains suspended in uncertainty, a ghost preserved not by memory but by silence. Its legacy is complex. For the families of those listed on the February 1951 transport orders, the absence of closure continues to wound across generations. Many descendants now living in Russia and abroad still submit petitions, hoping for confirmation that their relatives lived or died. None has been answered. Memorial groups acknowledge the missing records but can offer nothing beyond speculation. The Soviet system had perfected a technique of erasure so thorough that even the truth's outlines became unstable. Among historians, Convoy 7 has become a case study in state secrecy. The patterns of cover-up contradictory reports, destroyed files, falsified names, and intimidation of witnesses mirror other hidden Soviet operations, yet in this case, the gaps are unusually persistent. The codename Meteor, glimpsed repeatedly in internal directives, remains unexplained. Was it linked to nuclear logistics, experimental technology, or simply a bureaucratic cipher? Each possibility opens further questions, none conclusively answered. In folklore, the train survives in its most haunting form. Along the Yenisei and deep into Evenkia, people still whisper of a black locomotive heard in winter storms, its whistle echoing across frozen forests. Children are warned not to follow phantom rails. These stories blur the line between myth and memory, between superstition and suppressed history. They endure precisely because official truth never replaced them. What remains, decades later, is a silence that feels deliberate. The Soviet Union is gone, its archives partially opened, its ideology collapsed. Yet the vanished train of 1951 is still a void in the record, a scar that resists healing. Was it an accident, a catastrophe, or an intentional disappearance? Was it a prison convoy, a scientific transfer, or a cover for something more dangerous? No investigation has answered these questions. The absence itself has become the legacy. Convoy 7 reminds us that history is not only written in facts and figures, but also in erasures, in the spaces where memory has been forbidden to exist. It lingers as a chilling example of how a state can make people, places, and events vanish not only from the present, but from the future's ability to remember. And so, as the snow still falls silently on the empty Siberian tracks, the question remains, did the Soviet Union bury only a train, or something far darker that we have yet to uncover?